There is a question that follows every great work of art, every symphony that breaks your chest open, every painting that stops you cold in a museum hallway. The question is, what did it cost? Not the money, not the hours. What did it cost the person who made it? In pain, in loneliness, in years of their one life. Today we're going to find out. Three creators, three completely different centuries, countries, and art forms. One shared truth. The work came from the wound. Vincent van Gogh, Ludwig van Beethoven, Michelangelo. Let's start at the beginning. Picture a man in his late 20s who has already failed at everything. Failed as an art dealer, failed as a teacher, failed as a lay preacher in a Belgian coal mining village where he gave away nearly everything he owned to the miners and was dismissed by the church for taking the idea of poverty too literally. He is back living with his parents. He has almost no money. He has nothing, really, except a growing, desperate certainty that he was put on earth to paint. That man is Vincent van Gogh in 1880. He would produce in the next 10 years over 900 paintings. He would write more than 650 letters to his brother Theo, letters so raw, so precise about what it feels like to be inside a creative life that they remain one of the most extraordinary documents in all of art history. And he would sell, in his entire lifetime, exactly one painting. One. The Red Vineyard, for 400 francs, 4 months before he died. Think about the architecture of that life for a moment. He is painting at a pace that borders on mania, sometimes a canvas a day during his most fevered periods in Arles. He is writing to Theo constantly, not just asking for money, though he is always asking for money, but thinking out loud, working through color theory, describing the specific quality of light in Provence, processing failure after failure after failure. And almost no one is buying, almost no one is looking. In December of 1888, after a confrontation with his friend Paul Gauguin that has never been fully explained, Van Gogh severed part of his own left ear and brought it to a woman at a nearby brothel. He was found the next morning by police in his blood-soaked bed and hospitalized. In 1889, he voluntarily committed himself to the St. Paul de Moselle asylum in Saint-Rémy. He painted from his cell window. He painted the asylum garden. He painted the night sky over the Rhône in a way that made the darkness look alive. He wrote to Theo from inside that asylum, "I am not an adventurer by choice, but by fate." That line, that single line, contains the whole of it. He did not choose this life in the romantic way we sometimes imagine artists choose their suffering. He was pulled into it by something he could not name and could not resist. The stability he tried to build, the relationships, the jobs, the attempts at a normal life, all of it dissolved. What remained was the painting. And the painting, he wrote, demanded everything. I put my heart and my soul into my work and have lost my mind in the process. In the months before his death, a critic named Albert Aurier published the first major admiring review of Van Gogh's work. Recognition, the thing he had wanted so badly for so long, was finally arriving. It arrived too late. In July 1890, at 37 years old, Van Gogh was shot. Whether by his own hand or someone else's, historians still debate, and died 2 days later. Theo was with him. His last reported words, as recorded by Theo and by his doctor Paul Gachet, were, "The sadness will last forever." 900 paintings, one sale, 37 years, and the sadness lasts forever, except that the paintings are still here, and they are still stopping people cold in museum hallways 130 years later. That is what the cost bought. Now go back further. Vienna, 1802. Ludwig van Beethoven is 31 years old, and he is already one of the most celebrated musicians in Europe. And he is going deaf. It had been coming for several years, a ringing, a muffling, a terrifying gradual retreat of the one sense on which his entire existence depended. He was a pianist, a composer, a performer. Sound was not just his profession, it was the medium through which he understood the world and communicated everything that mattered to him. And it was leaving. He hid it as long as he could. He avoided conversations in noisy rooms. He apologized for mishearing things. He was terrified. Not just practically, not just professionally, but existentially. Who was he without his hearing? What was left? In October of 1802, he left Vienna for the small town of Heiligenstadt, and he wrote a letter. He addressed it to his brothers. He never sent it. It was found among his papers after his death, 25 years later, and it is one of the most shattering documents in the history of music. He wrote about the humiliation of his deafness, about standing next to people who could hear a flute in the distance while he heard nothing, about the despair that had brought him to the edge. He wrote, plainly, "I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back." Read that again. The only reason Ludwig van Beethoven did not die in 1802 was that he had not yet written what he needed to write. And then he made a decision. He sealed that letter, put it away, and went back to Vienna. He did not become quieter or more careful. He became louder. The works that followed, the Third Symphony, the Fifth, the Seventh, the Razumovsky quartets, are some of the most ferociously assertive music ever written. This was not a man making peace with his fate. This was a man in direct combat with it. He had written to his friend Franz Wegeler the year before the Testament, in one of the most defiant sentences any artist has ever committed to paper. "I shall seize fate by the throat. It shall certainly not bend and crush me completely." He meant it literally. He was not speaking metaphorically about creative challenges. He was talking about the physical, neurological destruction of the thing he needed most, and his refusal to yield to it. By the end of his life, he was functionally deaf. He composed using a wooden rod pressed against the soundboard of his piano and clenched between his teeth, feeling the vibrations through his jaw and skull, because that was all that was left to him. In 1824, when the Ninth Symphony premiered, the symphony that contains the Ode to Joy, one of the most recognized pieces of music in human history, Beethoven stood on the stage, conducting. He could not hear a single note. He could not hear the orchestra. He could not hear the chorus. When it ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation. He did not know. A soloist had to walk over and physically turn him around so he could see the applause he could not hear. He had written, in a different context, something that applies with brutal precision to that night. "What you are by accident of birth. What I am by myself. There have been and will be 1,000 princes. There is only one Beethoven." That is not vanity. That is a man who forged something permanent out of everything that tried to destroy him. The deafness did not stop the music. The music came from inside a silence that would have finished most people entirely. And somehow, in that silence, he heard the ninth. Now go back further still. Florence, late 15th century. A boy of perhaps 12 or 13 is being beaten by his father for wanting to make art. Lodovico Buonarroti was a minor Florentine official with aristocratic pretensions and deep ideas about what was and was not acceptable work for a family of his station. Sculpture was a manual trade. It was what craftsmen did, laborers, people who worked with their hands in the dirty and literal sense. It was not what a Buonarroti did. And his son, Michelangelo, would not stop doing it. The beatings did not stop it either. Michelangelo found his way into the workshop of the painter Ghirlandaio, and then into the Medici household, where Lorenzo de' Medici recognized what was in front of him and brought the boy into his circle of humanist scholars and artists. By his mid-20s, Michelangelo had carved the Pietà, the Virgin holding the dead Christ, with a technical mastery so complete that when people refused to believe a young artist had made it, He crept back into the basilica at night and carved his name across the Virgin's sash, the only work he ever signed. But the story that gets to the heart of what we're talking about today happens not in marble, but on a ceiling. In 1508, Pope Julius II, a warrior pope, a man who wore armor and led armies, commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Michelangelo protested. He said it plainly and repeatedly. He was a sculptor, not a painter. This was not false modesty. He genuinely considered himself a sculptor first, in the deepest sense of his identity. He did not want this commission. He did not believe he was the right person for it. He did it anyway. And it took 4 years. He worked largely alone on the scaffolding, his head bent backward for hours at a time, paint dripping onto his face and into his eyes. He was in sustained, daily physical agony. We know this because he wrote about it, not in a letter of complaint, but in a satirical sonnet addressed to his friend Giovanni da Pistoia, a poem in which he describes his own ruined body with a kind of dark, precise humor. He wrote, "My beard turns up to heaven, my nape falls in, fixed on my spine. My breastbone visibly grows like a harp, because I am in a dangerous position, bent, with my face in the air."
He is describing a body being destroyed by the work. And the work he is describing is the Sistine Chapel ceiling.
He lived to 88. He outlived almost everyone he loved. His great friend, and perhaps the deepest emotional relationship of his adult life, the poet Vittoria Colonna, died in 1547. His later decades were increasingly solitary. He kept working. In the last days of his life, he was still in his studio, still carving a Pietà he would never finish. When he died in February of 1564, the work was unfinished in his hands. He had said, at some point in his long old age, in words that have been reported by multiple people who knew him, "If people knew how hard I worked to get my mastery, it wouldn't seem so wonderful at all." And in the same long old age, still sketching, still carving, still pushing, he was said to have repeated a phrase that captured something essential about how he moved through the world. "I am still learning." The man who painted the Sistine ceiling, the man who carved the David and the Pietà and the Moses, still learning. That is what a driven life actually looks like from the inside. 3 men, 3 centuries, 3 completely different worlds. Van Gogh in his asylum cell in Saint-Remy, painting sunflowers and starry nights that no one was buying, writing to Theo that he dreamed of painting and then painted his dream, and asking, in a letter to his sister, the question that might be the animating question of all 3 of their lives. What would life be if we had no courage to attempt anything?
Beethoven, in his Heiligenstadt silence, choosing to come back, choosing to seize fate by the throat, biting a wooden rod pressed against a piano so he could feel the vibrations of music he could no longer hear in any ordinary human sense. Michelangelo, beaten as a boy for wanting what he wanted, then bent backward in agony for 4 years on a scaffold, describing his own broken body in verse, and still, in his studio at 88, still at the Pietà, still learning. What connects them is not suffering. Suffering alone produces nothing. What connects them is the refusal to let the suffering be the final word. The work was the answer. The work was the argument they made against everything that tried to stop them. Van Gogh sold 1 painting. He died at 37, unknown, in debt, and in pain. The last words attributed to him were about sadness that would last forever. But here is what is also true. The work lasted. The starry night lasted. The sunflowers lasted. The 650 letters to Theo lasted. The sadness lasted, and the beauty lasted. Together, inseparable, exactly as he painted them. Beethoven could not hear his greatest symphony. but he wrote it. The silence did not stop the music. It changed what the music was. Michelangelo's father beat him for picking up a chisel. The chisel did not go down. 88 years. Still learning. Still carving. The unfinished Pietà in his hands at the end is not a failure. It is proof that he was still reaching. This is what the cost actually buys. Not fame in their lifetime. Van Gogh barely had that. Not comfort. None of them had that. Not ease. What the cost bought was the work. The permanent, irreducible, undestroyable work. And the work is still here. And it is still asking you the same question Van Gogh asked his sister in 1888. What would life be if we had no courage to attempt anything? Thank you for listening to the story of Vincent van Gogh, Ludwig van Beethoven, and Michelangelo. If you'd like more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on who you'd like to hear about next.